Hello and a very warm welcome. In our part of the world, that is the Northern Hemisphere, it is about this time every year in the dead of winter that those of us lucky enough to have a warm house to go to notice just how many people are homeless on the streets. At least 320,000, we are told, in Britain. That's according to the charity Shelter. So we wonder whether lack of government policy is to blame, or are we simply forgetting those with nowhere to go? Welcome, you're watching Roundtable with me, David Foster. You know, homelessness in the UK has more than doubled in less than 10 years. The Prime Minister, Theresa May, says there is money available to sort it out. But perhaps she should look to Scandinavia. Finland is the only European country where homelessness is declining. Why?
At least 320,000 people in Britain are homeless, according to housing charity Shelter. The Bureau of Investigative Journalism says 449 homeless people died in the UK in 2017. A European housing body report ranks the UK 20th out of 28 EU states when it comes to adequate housing for all. UN Special Rapporteur William Alston says the government austerity policy has condemned millions in Britain to poverty. Last year, Prime Minister Theresa May said homelessness is a source of national shame and vowed to make it her personal mission. Her government introduced the Homelessness Reduction Act in 2018 to force local authorities to take all reasonable steps to prevent homelessness. How has the sixth wealthiest nation in the world reached what many call a crisis point?
With me at the round table, we have Brendon, Chilton, Labour Councillor for Ashford in Kent, that is in the east of England. Maeve, McClenaghan from the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, been looking into this problem. Saima Ahmed is here, a shelter coordinator in London, looks after many of the homeless. And Patrick Mulrenan, London Metropolitan University housing professor. Very good to have you with us. Maeve, I was staggered by that figure of 449, but that was October of last year. It's now standing at 550.
Yeah, that's right.
In just 2 extra months.
Yes, so we've been tracking at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, we've been logging how and when people are dying across the UK. And yeah, 100 more cases since we put out that first figure in October. Some of those are from, you know, earlier in the year, but we are seeing with a kind of frightening regularity new deaths happening. What
shocked you most about the work you did? And you're still doing it.
Yeah, it's very sobering to hear a little bit more about the lives. You know, these aren't just statistics, but I've been going to inquests, I've been going to funerals, interviewing family members, understanding the complexity of the issue, but also that behind every single one of those deaths is a person with lives and dreams and family members and friends, and trying to see, you know, where are the points that the system potentially failed them, that they could.
We'll look into that if we can in just a moment. Brendon, Ashford in Kent, Garden of England, down there near the port of Dover, which so many people are aware of. Is it because not enough money is being spent, or is it because people almost thought the problem was solved and they're looking elsewhere?
It's a whole host of issues. I mean, for example, we've had enormous cuts to local government over the past 10 years, combined with constraints in other public services. At the same time, you're seeing charities being forced to compete for smaller and smaller pots of money to deliver the services that they provide. So there are a whole host of reasons why this is happening, but also the impact of universal credit on families. And for the government, I think to say...
That's the new welfare payouts.
The new welfare...
For those who don't understand.
It's been brought in over a number of years into this country, and they're still tweaking it as we go along, because every other week, it seems, a new problem with the scheme emerges. And so all these things combined, even in fairly affluent rural shires of England, you're seeing now homelessness and an increase in homelessness, which we have not seen before.
And you think it is simply down to that? Or? It's a very rapid increase in the
It is a very rapid increase. I think, of course, there are one of the interesting areas. We tend to hear this sort of generic statement that a lot of people on the streets are ex-service men and women who have gone to war and fought in other conflicts. Now, we have had a number of conflicts over the past 10 years where British servicemen and women have been sent abroad, so I imagine a significant portion of those homeless might be that. You may know more about this. But at the same time, we're seeing, as a result of the impact of welfare changes and cuts to public services, that impact being rolled out into communities. People that used to be able to access mental health can't access it anymore, so they can't then manage their affairs appropriately. People who are being driven into food banks. I mean, in the 6th richest country in the world, we've got people having to queue up for food from charities and donations, and we tell us we're one of the greatest countries in the world. We're not. That's totally unpatriotic and poorly decent behaviour.
Simon, I will ask you about your experience at the shelter in just a moment, but Patrick, to follow up from what Brendon was saying there, we're now 20th of all EU states when it comes to providing adequate housing. I say we, the United Kingdom, 20th on a list of all of the EU states. Do you agree with that, or do you got other thoughts?
Well, I do agree with that, but I think there's also a longer-term problem, is we haven't built enough homes for the last 40 years, and that's not a party political point. It's under Labour and Conservative governments. We've just failed to build the right number of homes where they're needed, and specifically homes that are affordable. I think a second element that comes in here that we should talk about really is the role of the private rented sector, is that increasingly people are moving into the private rented sector, and it's very expensive, but it's also very insecure. And it means that if you complain about the conditions you're in, for example, your landlord can then evict you with giving no reason. And a statistic I saw last week was that if you complain...
And that is within the law?
It is. If you've got a 6-month tenancy, the landlord just has to wait until the end of the tenancy and then can ask you to leave.
And you deal with an awful lot of rough sleepers.
Yep.
First shelter inside a mosque.
Yes.
How does it work? Who do you see? What type?
So half, I guess, tend to be locals from the UK, and the other half tend to be refugees and migrants that have made their way over. But it's a whole range of individuals. At the moment, we've got 15 guests, and 9 of them are migrants and refugees, and the rest are locals. But it's how they've ended up in that situation, and I find a lot of the time, especially the locals, it's broken down relationships, it's that support network that they have just failed.
It being a mosque, am I right in assuming that these are all male or all female?
No, they're both male and
they are
female.
split.
Yes.
Because one of the biggest causes of homelessness amongst females is domestic violence.
Yes.
Is that your understanding of it, where you
I would say a lot of the females that I see throughout my night shelter that I run, they are mostly migrants, and because it's a low support night shelter, so a lot of the females that have had domestic violence past, they wouldn't be attending my shelter. There's already set up hostels for...
But you hear these stories?
Yes, all the time, all the time.
When it comes to the type of stories that you're hearing, and let's face it, Maeve, you are dealing with an awful lot of anecdotal evidence, because an awful lot of the people that you write about are no longer here. They have died. But what reasons do you understand to be the most underlying for the homeless crisis we have? And it is a crisis.
Yeah. I think what is interesting has been that almost every single person, it is a complexity of issues. There's various different things happening as at once. There's ends of private tenancies, there's breakdowns in family relationships, cuts to drug and alcohol services. What I've been hearing a lot is this really worrying catch-22 of trying to access mental health services and being told we're not going to do that until you deal with your drug and alcohol dependency, and then trying to access those kind of services and being told we're not going to deal with that until you deal with your underlying mental health issues. So you're just caught absolutely in the middle.
Absolutely, because you're not going to be able to fix your mental health or drug issues until you have somewhere. It's going to be pretty much impossible until you have somewhere stable to call home, and you can then move on with your life. If you're stuck on the streets or wherever it happens to be, then the problem will persist.
Yeah, and I spoke to one woman who was talked down from the cliffs of Beachy Head, suicidal, and she wasn't deemed critical enough to get mental health emergency treatment. So we've really got to a kind of crisis point where you have to be absolutely a death's door, it seems, before people will open it.
I will mention Finland again. I did in the introduction to the programme. We are going to be talking to somebody who studied this in some detail. And of course they have the sort of situation that you've just described, where you don't have to have a cure for your problems. You go into housing, then you get sorted out. We'll be doing that a little bit later on. Why have we fallen so far behind everybody else? Because other people have got financial problems in their countries as well. I mean, in terms of austerity, it can't just be.
I think part of the reason is, I mean, if you look at the general trend, most people on the continent, as I understand, are renters, whereas we are buyers in this country of property. And we have a view of property in this country that's very, very different to the rest of Europe. We see it as an asset, a tool by which you can generate wealth. People on the continent perhaps see it as a home. We've got this huge issue, particularly in London, where enormous swathes of developments that are built. If you look down the South Bank, not far from here, for the benefit of people listening, there are huge flats going up all along the South Bank of the Thames. If you go past at night time, all the lights are off. No one's living there. They're empty.
But even if they were renting them out, nobody could afford them.
Well, this is the other angle. What they're building is very expensive and bought by foreign investors. And then, as was said earlier on, rents, are, particularly in London and the South East, rents are far too high and people simply cannot afford to rent them.
What about vulnerability? Let me ask you this one, Saima, because you said you told me this before we came on. You got quite interested in all of this because you could see yourself perhaps being in the same situation as many of the people who are homeless. It's easy just to go off the edge.
I think it is very easy just to go off the edge, and it is that support network, right, rather that being monetary or a support around your family and your network. But a lot of these individuals lack that, especially the support around families and as you know, as we all know, the cuts to the mental health, and as well as that, all the day centres, they've also had cuts coming through them as well. So they've had to reduce the amount of individuals that they can see on a daily basis. So it's like an onward spiral, and trying to capture individuals before they even get to that stage is really difficult.
Did you sense, because of a difficult time in your life, not necessarily that it would happen to you, but it would be very easy for something like this to happen, and you recognise that in so many of the people?
Yes, if I didn't have my family, my friends, my support network, it would have happened to me.
There's some research, I think, that said over a third of people in the UK are just one paycheck away from homelessness. You know, you don't have the savings in your account to pay your mortgage or your rent if you were to be made redundant tomorrow. And, you know,
but it's not just about...
1/3?
I think at least 1/3.
Yeah. But it's not just about putting a roof over someone's head. At the moment, guests that move on from our night shelter and go into private and rented accommodation, they end up back on the streets because we, as a night shelter project, have given them that support, that and they lose that the minute they leave us. And it's even councils having support networks set up for those individuals that have ended up homeless and then have moved on.
Patrick, what about university students or young people in particular? But you work at a university.
Yeah, I work at a university. I did a piece of research in the last couple of years about our own students. So actually, they're quite wide-ranging in terms of age. We have a wide participation of students. So many of our students, for example, have got children. And I decided to do a piece of research, and I was quite shocked when I sent an email out to students to say, would you like to be interviewed? And I immediately got 30 students who were homeless or threatened with homelessness. And I was really quite surprised at that, mainly in temporary accommodation. I suspect this is something that's going to be repeated across universities in high demand housing areas. And we interviewed them, and they, like you were saying, they all had an individual story to tell, and quite tragic stories, but were overcoming those just to get a degree. They're so determined to get a degree.
And of course the problem is that they have debts as well. They don't necessarily have an income.
Yeah.
It's a very difficult one to solve. Brendon, we've talked about homelessness as an overall problem. In your particular part of England, is it rough sleeping, or is it the hidden side of homelessness, perhaps?
Well, there's an assortment of issues that we're facing, and again, it's a surprise because it's a fairly leafy, affluent part of the country where one wouldn't normally expect to see homelessness. We have a particular issue with domestic violence on women having to go into shelters and refuges. There's also an issue with private landlords. We have a particular issue where we have one or two private landlords that own literally several hundred properties each, and on a whim, they decide that certain tenants are not going to be allowed to live there anymore, people in receipt of universal credit, for example, or any other form of welfare. or people that don't speak English, and they are literally able to run riot and do as they wish with people's lives.
And how do you help people in that situation?
Well, again, the challenge facing local authorities, not just mine, is that you get these people turning up to the council offices saying, I've just been made homeless, my landlord has evicted me, or my partner is too violent and I can't stay with him. The council's reaction is not to provide them with social or public housing, as some of your viewers may hear, but to direct them to the private sector. So all you're doing really is kicking the can down the road. And we say we have a choice. A market is meant to be a choice. We don't have a choice in this country. The choice is the private rented sector. There is no real public.
But with this being such a pressing public concern, should it be a responsibility of central government rather than your particular branch of local government to provide some national support network for people in this position?
Absolutely, and I totally agree with the points that were raised earlier. Both governments, Labour, Conservative, and when we had the coalition government, failed miserably to build enough public housing in this country. We're quite happy for development to be private-led and, of course, for the affordable element to diminish. If you sit in any planning committee up and down this country, virtually every meeting you will find the target set by local authorities for affordable housing is undercut because developers say they can't afford it. And you can read any minutes of any planning committee up and down this country and you'll see it month on month.
And I think the argument for that central funding is also the issue of local connection. So lots of councils refusing to support people that come to them because they say you can't prove that you've been here for 3 years or 5 years. And, you know, we know that people that are living homeless and people that are experiencing domestic violence, whatever it might be, move around the country. And then if you find that you can't access any services because you haven't got proof of, you know, council tax bills for 5 years. Whereas if there was a central kind of government pot, there would be potentially less emphasis on councils to...
Okay. Well, Brendon, thank you. Thank you very much indeed for identifying one particular part of the country that you know so well, but it could be replicated in so many other different parts of the United Kingdom. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
No problem.
Okay, well, that's looking at it from one particular perspective. We did mention Finland, so we're going to broaden it out to that Scandinavian country. Interestingly, we're going to Leicestershire in the UK, where we find Louise Winterburn. She's from World Habitat, leads the European End Street Homelessness Campaign. And this is the Why Foundation. Louise, first of all, thank you very much. Welcome to the programme. We're talking about what's called the Why Foundation in Finland. Start at the beginning and tell us what they've done and where perhaps other people could learn.
Okay, well, the Why Foundation is an amazing organisation based in Finland that was set up to end homelessness in Finland. In the 1980s, they started to look at a growing number of homeless people on their streets, and they decided to do things a bit differently. And what they looked at was an approach that's called Housing First. And a little bit about what people have been saying already in the studio about different services, a catch-22, things not working for people on the streets. They decided the most important thing to provide was affordable, secure housing for homeless people, and that's exactly what they did. So from the 1980s, they started building, renovating and leasing housing to homeless people.
Did that
and then they would put...
Sorry, did that mean they already had the housing available, they just had to make sure it was used properly, or was there a huge building programme as well?
There was a building and funding programme that took over time. So as they were able to show that this worked, they were able to show amazing rates of what often happens with homeless people, as some of your guests have already briefly mentioned, is that you get people accessing services, it doesn't work, they're back on the street, things get more and more difficult, then another service is offered, if that doesn't work. What Housing First does is say, let's get the housing right, and then we'll build on that with the right kind of services so that people keep their tenancies, they don't go back to the streets. So as they were able to prove that that worked, as they had the evidence, they were able to get more cities involved, more municipalities, more funding, they were able to get more voluntary sector funding, and they were able to then start having more and more homes. So they were able to build, I mentioned it started in the 1980s. In 2016, they had over 6,600 apartments in 52 cities and municipalities. So this is wide-ranging change in the way that Finland started working with homeless people. And the wide-ranging change was about seeing it as a housing problem. This is about getting good quality, affordable housing in place.
It's not just for me to sit here and ask the questions. If any of you want to throw something at Louise, then please do so. Anything immediately?
I think it's worth talking about. It's not directly addressing that, but in terms of the population of homeless people just in London, it's around about 59,000 households just in London in council temporary accommodation in the private rented sector. It's a huge problem. I don't really know whether it's such an extensive problem in Finland. I don't know whether it's comparable to Finland. It's such a massive issue in London. And
yeah, I mean, when when the Y Foundation was first started its work, its homeless rates were very, very similar to the UK.
Oh, right.
So you would have seen a very similar picture if you went out in the 1980s. And I think the important thing about the Y Foundation and also other cities that are making this change, this shift. So another award winner. So one of the things World Habitat does is find really amazing housing projects from all over the world. So we don't just look at homeless issues, but another really amazing homeless project is the 100,000 Homes campaign. They also use, in America, they also use the same approach. Housing is the key thing that's missing when it comes to homelessness. And they again have in cities got down to 0 rates of homelessness because of their approach that they've taken.
It sounds a bit sort of like it's a non-starter, really, isn't it, to say that homes are the answer to homelessness? But some people don't realise that.
No, exactly. And I think the psychological burden of being labelled as homeless immediately goes away as soon as you're given a roof over your head. And then you can deal with those other things in time, but you'll no longer have that, you know, stigma and that label of being a homeless person.
But those other things kind of are a lot worse than just putting like a roof over someone's head. I think those other things also need to be addressed someone going into accommodation, and whether that's on their own or if that's supported housing, because supporting housing is actually really, it works and it does really well.
But isn't this the counter-argument that you have to treat people before they get homes, whereas in fact if you give them homes then it becomes much easier for them to work on themselves and for other people to deal with them as well?
I totally agree, but I also there shouldn't be too much of a gap between sticking someone in with like putting a roof over their head and kind of fixing those problems as well. Like, I think it needs to be done coincidingly, like instead of one after another.
Yeah, it's true. I heard of a man in the West Midlands who was given a home and was sleeping in his living room in his tent because he just wasn't acclimatised to how you live and didn't get any extra support beyond the roof. So yeah, it's the additional support that comes.
This is interesting because I have read, and I don't know whether this is true, I'll ask any one of you, that some people who sleep rough would prefer to sleep rough rather than go to shelters because then they get to become part of a system that they don't trust.
I think there's an element of truth in that. People do need support, but I think the emphasis should be always on actually preventing people getting on the street in the first place, rather than, you know, this fantastic scheme that's being described there, but it's kind of, you know, dealing with the problem once it's a problem. And preventing people should be the focus of the work we do. And once you're on the street, if you don't have a drink problem, if you don't have a drugs problem, by the time you come off the street, you may well have them. Those sorts of issues develop while you're on the street.
We will expand on this a great deal in the second part of our roundtable on homelessness. But Louise, let me come to you on this one. Was there a light bulb moment for the people who put this all together when they said, look, we have to have a different approach? Obviously, it's been very successful, but what was it that made them go down this route?
I think the light bulb moment, and it's happening across lots of cities. So the campaign I'm involved in, it's 13 cities that are working on developing housing first to reflect what's needed across different cities in Europe. I think the light bulb moment is when you realise that something isn't working. So the conversation earlier about actually there is a need for emergency shelters for a few nights while we're working out what people might need next. There are some people that need different sorts of accommodation. Housing First works for those people who have very complicated issues, who maybe have been living on street homeless for quite some years or months. And so you actually need a whole variety of provision because people are individuals and we need different things at different times. So I think the light bulb moment was what we're providing at the moment isn't working for everybody, and some of the most vulnerable people are on our streets and they're dying there. So we need to do something differently, and that's exactly that conversation is happening.
And those other cities where it is being rolled out, what feedback are you getting?
Well, I mean, there are a number of pilots that are going on, some of them funded by the government within England. In Scotland, they've actually made wholesale change over to looking at tackling homelessness through a housing first approach, and that's just coming into place now. In the 13 European cities I work for, these are cities that themselves have chosen and said, we want to do something different and we want to make a change. And they've said what works, and Housing First is one of the things that they are looking at bringing in. Okay. So they're all in their first year or 2 years of actually bringing that process in. So some of them have got new types of accommodation. Other people are looking at that catch-22 situation around services and saying we need to change our service provision.
Okay, quick thought from one of you before we go to
is
the
there
end
a reason
of this
why
programme. We're coming back, of course.
Is there a reason why London hasn't picked this up?
Question we cannot have at this particular point because we're running out of time on this, our first programme. We will be coming back with another edition on this same topic. For now, Louise, thank you very much indeed. Maeve, we're going to go into some of the other work you've been doing, not just with UK figures about the number of unfortunate people who've lost their lives because of homelessness, but when you've been looking at it in other countries as well. And the overall picture, the student thing is very worrying for me, and I will give you the opportunity to ask your question next time around. Don't think of me as a rude man, just a man who has to abide by the clock. Thank you very much indeed. Listen, we will be back talking more about this. It is not just a British problem, but what is happening here in the UK is clearly of concern. The number of homeless people having risen by 134%, more than doubled within the last decade. The reasons why, how can it be sorted out? Thank you for watching. From me, David Foster, and the team, we will have your company, I hope, next time.